Hello, I'm Yolanda Barnes, Head of Residential Research at Savills. I'm pleased to introduce to you our latest research publication, The World in London, which talks about how people from all corners of the globe are coming to invest in London real estate. So our World in London spotlight is really designed to bust some myths about the prime central London market. Anyone reading the London newspapers might think that London is completely dominated by wealthy Russian oligarchs or Chinese billionaires, but a lot of what is reported is actually hype. And it seems that some journalists are talking to one or two agents who report an exotic buyer in the previous week, and that's being turned into a trend. In actual fact, the prime London markets reflect London as a whole. London's a very cosmopolitan city. More than 1 in 3 occupants were born overseas, and that is reflected in our prime London areas. We find that on average 34% of buyers are from overseas. Most of those buyers are buying their main residence, over 60% are owner-occupiers. Another 20% or so are buying investments for letting. The remainder are owning second homes. That's a trend that is very typical of London, particularly in the central area. For a couple of centuries now, the London season and the wealthy occupancy of places like Mayfair and Belgravia has meant that there have been very low occupancy rates for half the year.
Jonathan Hewlett, Director, Head of Savills London Residential. There's always been a thought that London is a sort of ghost town full of apartments and houses that are only used in August or September or other times of the year. We live in a world that now is totally transient, and people come and go in and out of this city all year long. And what you see now, I think more and more, is people come into London for 2 weeks, a month, move on to their other destinations. We sit in the middle of the globe and people come and go all the time.
It is easier to say who doesn't come and buy in London than who does. What's noticeable about buyers is that they come from every corner of the globe. Most of these buyers are Western Europeans, so 15% are from Western Europe and the Nordic countries, and the rest are from a very wide variety of other countries. In fact, the only global region that isn't represented very highly at the moment is Latin America. If we home in on the second-hand market in the prime central London area, we find that 59% of buyers in that market are from overseas. In the second-hand market, it's the Western Europeans and the Eastern Europeans who completely dominate, so 20% from Western Europe, 15% from Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union. The remainder are evenly spread pretty much between other countries, North Americans, Middle Easterners and South Asian subcontinent, Indians in particular, significant portions of that market. Prime central London new build is the most international market. In fact, if you look at prime central London new build over 5 million, then about 85% of buyers are from overseas. If you look across the board at all price ranges, again, you're seeing a huge dominance of Pacific Asians, but also notable increase in the number of Middle Easterners at 18% in that market. So all these different markets will yield some very different figures, and it's these that are picked up on from time to time in the press. But what our document shows is that we understand the subtleties, we understand the geographical locations of different buyers, and we understand how they're operating in the market. Undoubtedly, the central London areas are particularly cosmopolitan. In prime central London, we see 59% at the moment are overseas buyers. That is because London is undoubtedly acting, and indeed global real estate, so not just London. World cities like Hong Kong and Singapore are behaving in very similar ways, are acting as safe havens, a store of wealth. There are 3 main types of overseas buyer. The most neglected, probably, when it comes to press headlines and indeed government policy making, are simply those overseas residents of London who are living and working here, and who very often are looking for family houses and tend to be much more widespread than just the prime central London area, occupying in particular the areas with the good schools, for example, in the southwest, if they have families, and spreading right up to Hampstead and Islington. So they're pretty much everywhere. And that overseas purchase, which is 60% of the market overall, is very much dependent on the health of London and its ongoing economic story. Another 20% or so of overseas buyers are buying as investors, becoming landlords. This myth of the lock it up and leave it investor is actually just that. A lot of stock will be occupied, especially in the new schemes that are bought by such investors. Finally, there are the 20% or so of our buyers who are buying second homes, not their main residence and not for occupation by somebody else through letting. Now, these buyers are going to be occupying at lower levels of occupancy than the others. They tend to be concentrated in central London and really continue a tradition of 200 years or so where the wealthy have always occupied London only for the season, so leaving their properties empty for maybe half a year. So overseas purchase of London real estate is a major export industry. We estimate since the end of 2006 about £18 billion of net new investment has come into the prime London market, most of it landing in central London. This is a very important component in the story of funding of new housing in central London, and has by extension financed or helped to finance some social housing provision. So some of the most active countries at the moment with a large net inward flow are Russians, Italians and French, whereas a few, noticeably the Irish and Americans, are actually net disinvestors just. Australians are right in the middle. They buy as much as they sell, so they're turning over at an average rate. The net flows tend to therefore be coming from either Europe or some of the new economies like China and Russia. And I guess that's why those particular buyers are seen as so important in the market at the moment. So when it comes to overseas buying patterns and their geographical distribution, we find that overseas buyers do tend to congregate in the central areas, usually the parts of London that they're simply most familiar with. However, the more mature markets, particularly, for example, the Northern Europeans who are much more familiar with London and more likely to be both living and working here, go further afield. So the distribution, for example, of Italian and French buyers looks quite different to that of overseas buyers as a whole. These buyers are much more likely to be interested in family houses, in which case a lot of them will congregate around the Lycée, for example, in South Kensington. And there's a lot of buying activity in the domestic markets, the family housing markets of southwest London through Fulham and into Wandsworth, for example. Newer buyers who are not so familiar with London, and particularly who are not familiar with the period property product, will tend to buy what they're familiar with or more familiar with in their home countries. So Asia-Pacific buyers, and particularly Chinese who are familiar with new build, high-rise and the emergence of new financial districts, we find to be particularly favouring Canary Wharf at the moment. It's much more like what they're used to at home. Interestingly, the Hong Kong Chinese buyers who have been familiar with London purchases for a longer period of time are much more likely to buy period and buy further west. So we expect in future that these buying habits will change. So what we can see is that London is, and always has been, a cosmopolitan city where influxes of overseas wealth have impacted the real estate markets. London is operating as a world city and has much more in common at the moment with Hong Kong and Singapore than it does with the other regions of the UK. From time to time, it will be the domestic economy that drives London. From time to time, it will be the outperformance of London's economy. And from time to time, particularly during recession, it is the safe haven store of wealth story that's important to London's growth. The next phase of London is probably going to be one with less influence from the overseas investor and much more about how London's own businesses, the new tech industries, the management buyouts, the IPOs and so forth, and the recovery of the City of London are driving prices ahead. But in the meantime, overseas wealth continues to forward finance and be very important to London's developers. It enables new areas to be regenerated and social housing to be built. And it keeps London on the world map and seen as a good place to live, work and invest. So London developers have to think about their product in the context of a global one. In other words, what else could people buy in, say, Singapore or Hong Kong or increasingly the USA? When it comes to domestic sellers of second-hand property, there are considerations about who it might sell to, how it's marketed, who it's going to appeal to, and how to reach those different markets to the ones that London has been used to in the past.
Hi, I'm Dominic Grace. I run our London residential development business. The World in London report highlights what we already know, which is international buyers are extremely important to the prime market in London, but it particularly emphasises their importance in the new build market, as evidenced in the statistics that you'll see in it.
So there are many different implications for property people and their advisors, and we think as a result of this type of research we're particularly well placed to give this advice.